Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might keep you thinking long after you drift off. How does a nation sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, more black gold than Saudi Arabia, end up with citizens unable to afford a loaf of bread? Venezuela's story isn't just about economics or politics. It's a cautionary tale written in crude oil and broken promises, one that takes us from unimaginable wealth to unthinkable poverty in barely 2 generations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got personal experience with economic collapse, hyperinflation, or remember the oil shocks of the 70s, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through economic upheavals that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're living in Caracas in 1955, and life is good. Really good. Venezuela isn't just wealthy. It's the richest country in Latin America, with a per capita income rivaling European nations. Oil money flows like the petroleum itself, funding gleaming skyscrapers, modern highways, and social programs that are the envy of the hemisphere. The currency, the bolivar, is strong and stable. Middle-class families can afford imported luxuries. The future seems limitless. This wasn't a mirage. For those who remember the post-war boom years, Venezuela's prosperity was as real as Detroit's automotive dominance or Pittsburgh's steel mills. The country had struck black gold in staggering quantities. And unlike many developing nations, it seemed to be managing its windfall with something approaching wisdom. Or so everyone thought. To understand Venezuela's rise and fall, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when this story truly started. December 14th, 1922. Lake Maracaibo, Western Venezuela. A drilling rig operated by Royal Dutch Shell punched through a particular layer of rock and struck something extraordinary. The well, designated Barroso II, didn't just produce oil, it exploded with it. A gusher shooting petroleum 100 feet into the air, producing 100,000 barrels per day. For 9 days, workers struggled to cap the well while crude oil sprayed across the landscape like a black fountain. It was the kind of strike that changes history. Venezuela had known about oil for centuries. Indigenous peoples had used natural tar seeps for waterproofing and medicine. Spanish colonists documented black, sticky substances bubbling from the ground. But nobody understood what they really had until the internal combustion engine made petroleum the most valuable commodity on Earth. After Barroso II, the rush was on. By 1929, Venezuela was the world's second-largest oil producer, exceeded only by the United States. Foreign companies, Shell, Standard Oil, Gulf, swarmed the country like prospectors in a gold rush. They signed concessions, erected derricks, and began pumping crude from beneath Venezuelan soil at a rate that staggered the imagination. The oil was high quality, relatively easy to extract, and seemingly inexhaustible. Geologists kept finding more. Lake Maracaibo alone held reserves that could supply the world for decades. The Orinoco Belt contained heavy crude in quantities that defied belief. Venezuela, a relatively poor agricultural country of a few million people, suddenly controlled a treasure beyond measure. For those who've worked in heavy industry, whether shipyards, factories, or oil fields, you'll recognize the pattern. The work was brutal. Men labored in crushing tropical heat, often standing ankle-deep in crude oil, breathing petroleum fumes, risking their lives on rickety derricks that could collapse without warning. It wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous, exhausting, dirty work that paid better than anything else available to working-class Venezuelans. But the rewards, at least at the national level, seemed worth the cost. Oil revenue began transforming Venezuela's economy in the 1930s and 40s. The government collected royalties and taxes from foreign oil companies. That money built roads, hospitals, schools. It modernized Caracas from a sleepy colonial town into a genuine capital city. It funded universities and technical institutes. It created a middle class where none had existed before. By the 1950s and 60s, Venezuela had achieved something remarkable. It wasn't just extracting oil. It was building a modern nation on petroleum revenues. The country's transformation would have seemed like fantasy to earlier generations. Caracas became a showcase. Modernist architects designed buildings that appeared in international journals. Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese immigrants arrived seeking opportunity, welcomed by a government that understood it needed skilled workers and professionals. The metro system, completed in the 1980s, would become the pride of Latin America. Universities graduated engineers and doctors. The standard of living rose year after year. Think about what this meant in practical terms. A Venezuelan family in 1970 could afford things that would have been impossible luxuries a generation earlier. Color television, a car, maybe even imported, vacations in Miami or Madrid. Their children could attend university without crippling debt. Healthcare was available and affordable. The bolivar was so strong that Venezuelans traveled abroad and marveled at how cheap everything seemed. This was real wealth, distributed broadly enough that millions experienced its benefits directly. It wasn't just the elite living well. Teachers, shopkeepers, factory workers, ordinary people saw their lives improve year after year. Those who remember the American prosperity of the 50s and 60s will recognize the pattern. Rising incomes, expanding opportunities, genuine optimism about the future. The government called it Sembrar el Petróleo, sowing the oil. The idea was simple and appealing. Use petroleum revenues to build a diversified, modern economy. Don't just extract and export crude. Invest the proceeds in education, infrastructure, and industries that would provide prosperity long after the oil ran dry. It was a sensible plan, and for a time, it seemed to be working. Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC in 1960, joining with other oil-producing nations to coordinate production and stabilize prices. It was a power move, a declaration that Venezuela would be an equal partner with the major producers, not just a passive source of crude for American and European refineries. The oil kept flowing, billions of barrels per year, generating billions of dollars in revenue. In 1973, when OPEC flexed its muscles during the Arab oil embargo, Venezuelan revenues exploded. The price of crude quadrupled almost overnight. Money poured into the treasury faster than anyone knew how to spend it wisely. But even during the boom years, problems were accumulating like pressure in a well that hasn't been properly monitored. Luxury. Thy name is ignoring warning signs while money flows freely. The Venezuelan economy was becoming dangerously dependent on a single commodity. Oil revenue accounted for more than 90% of export earnings by the 1970s. When oil prices were high, everything seemed fine. When they dipped, even slightly, the entire economy shuddered. It was like building a skyscraper on a single pillar. Impressive when stable, catastrophic when that pillar weakens. Agriculture withered. Why struggle with farming when you could make more money in the oil industry or in businesses serving oil workers? Coffee production, once Venezuela's primary export, declined sharply. Cattle ranching diminished. The fertile valleys and highlands that could have fed the nation increasingly depended on food imports purchased with petroleum dollars. Manufacturing never took root the way planners hoped. Why invest in building factories when you could import everything you needed with strong petrodollars? The exchange rate made foreign goods artificially cheap. Venezuelan consumers developed a taste for imported products, and domestic industries couldn't compete. The planned diversification remained more aspiration than reality. Those who lived through the decline of American manufacturing in the 70s and 80s will recognize the economic dynamics. When one industry dominates, offering higher wages and better prospects, other sectors starve for talent and investment. The difference is that Venezuela's dominant industry, oil extraction, employed relatively few people directly while generating most of the national wealth. Government spending ballooned. Every boom year brought new programs, new subsidies, new commitments. Gasoline was subsidized to the point of being essentially free, cheaper than bottled water. Electricity prices were kept artificially low. Food staples were subsidized. Currency exchange rates were manipulated to keep imports cheap. These policies were popular naturally. Who complains about cheap gas and affordable imported goods? But they created hidden costs that would only become apparent later. The subsidies had to be funded from oil revenues. When those revenues fell, the subsidies became unsustainable. But try explaining that to voters who've come to expect them as rights rather than privileges, funded by temporary high oil prices. Corruption grew alongside the spending. With billions flowing through state-controlled oil company, PDVSA, and government ministries, opportunities for graft multiplied. Contracts were awarded to connected companies. Officials skimmed percentages. Money disappeared into offshore accounts. It wasn't unique to Venezuela. Anyone who's worked in or around government contracting knows the patterns. But the scale was extraordinary because the money involved was extraordinary. 1983 brought a reckoning. Oil prices crashed, falling from over $30 per barrel to under $10. Venezuela's economy, built on assumptions of perpetually high prices, collapsed like a house of cards. The government devalued the bolivar. Capital flight accelerated as those with means moved money offshore. Inflation spiked. The prosperity machine sputtered. But instead of fundamental reforms, Venezuela doubled down on the same approach. Borrow money to cover shortfalls. Maintain subsidies to keep citizens happy. Promise that higher oil prices would return and solve everything. It was the economic equivalent of a gambler betting more to cover losses, convinced the next hand would be the winner. Those were the years when the seeds of future catastrophe were planted, though few recognized it at the time. The economy recovered somewhat when oil prices stabilized, but the structural problems remained unaddressed. Venezuela was still overwhelmingly dependent on petroleum. Agriculture and manufacturing were still withering. The government was still spending beyond sustainable levels. Corruption was still endemic. If you lived through economic shocks in the 70s or 80s, oil embargoes, stagflation, recessions, you understand how quickly prosperity can vanish when the fundamentals are unsound. Drop a comment if those years taught you lessons about economic fragility. Your perspective on what real economic disruption looks like is valuable here. February 4th, 1992. Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Rafael Chavez Frias led a military coup attempt against the Venezuelan government. The coup failed. Chavez was captured and imprisoned, but in a television appearance lasting less than 2 minutes, he asked his co-conspirators to stand down for now, implying that their struggle would continue. Those 2 words, por ahora, for now, electrified Venezuela's poor and working class, who saw in this failed coup leader something they'd been desperately seeking: hope for change. By the late 90s, the Venezuelan political establishment had thoroughly discredited itself. Corruption was rampant and undisguised. The 2 traditional parties alternated power in arrangements that seemed designed to maintain elite privilege rather than serve the public. Income inequality had widened dramatically. Oil wealth continued flowing, but increasingly it enriched a narrow class while the majority struggled. Venezuela's poverty rate had risen to nearly 50%. In Caracas, massive hillside slums, barrios, sprawled across the mountainsides, their improvised housing visible from the gleaming downtown skyscrapers. These weren't the temporary shanties of rural migrants making transition to city life. These were permanent settlements of people left behind by an economy that generated enormous wealth, but distributed it grotesquely unevenly. Hugo Chavez understood this divide viscerally. Born into poverty himself, with mixed indigenous and African ancestry, he embodied the Venezuela that elites preferred to ignore. He was an outsider to the political class, which made him precisely what disaffected voters wanted. He spoke their language, shared their resentments, promised a Bolivarian revolution that would reclaim Venezuela's oil wealth for ordinary Venezuelans rather than foreign companies and corrupt elites. His 1998 presidential campaign was a phenomenon. He promised to rewrite the Constitution, redistribute wealth, challenge American imperialism, and create what he called 21st century socialism. To the poor, it sounded like justice finally arriving. To the middle class, exhausted by corruption and economic stagnation, it sounded like necessary reform. To the wealthy and foreign investors, it sounded like dangerous populism. Chavez won in a landslide, 56% of the vote. It wasn't even close. Venezuela had decided it wanted something radically different from the status quo. Whether what it got would be better or worse remained to be seen. But the old order was finished. In his first years, Chavez moved carefully. Oil prices were recovering from their 1990s lows. He drafted a new constitution that was approved by referendum. He won re-election in 2000. He launched social programs, the missions, that provided health care, education, and food subsidies to the poor. Cuban doctors arrived to staff clinics in barrios that had never had medical services. Literacy programs taught adults to read. Community councils gave poor neighborhoods direct access to government resources. For millions of Venezuelans, these programs were life-changing. If you've never had access to a doctor, and suddenly there's a clinic in your neighborhood providing free care, that's transformative. If your children can attend school with free meals provided, that changes everything. If you're learning to read at age 40, that opens possibilities you'd abandoned as impossible. The missions were funded directly by oil revenues. Chavez channeled petroleum profits through new programs rather than existing bureaucracies, deliberately bypassing institutions he saw as corrupt and hostile. It was effective politics, and for a time, effective poverty reduction. Venezuela's poverty rate fell. Infant mortality declined. Literacy improved. Living conditions in the barrios got marginally better. But this approach had fundamental flaws that would only become apparent later. The missions bypassed existing institutions rather than reforming them. Hospitals and schools that had served Venezuelans for decades were starved of resources, while new parallel programs received funding. This created redundancy and waste. More importantly, it made the entire social safety net dependent on sustained high oil revenues and Chavez's political survival. Traditional state institutions, the civil service, the judiciary, the military, the state oil company, PDVSA, were systematically politicized. Chavez demanded loyalty above competence. Professionals who questioned his policies were purged. Military officers who showed insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm were sidelined. PDVSA, once run as a relatively professional enterprise despite corruption, became a vehicle for political patronage. Here's where we need to talk about something economists call the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty. Countries with abundant natural resources, particularly oil, often end up poorer and more unstable than countries without such blessings. It's counterintuitive. Surely having vast oil reserves should make a country wealthy and stable. But history suggests otherwise. The mechanism is insidious. Oil wealth flows directly to the government through royalties and state-owned companies. This creates a system where the government doesn't need to tax citizens to fund itself. Instead, it distributes oil revenues through subsidies, programs, and patronage. Citizens become clients of the state rather than taxpayers demanding accountability. This inverts the normal relationship between government and governed. In countries where governments must tax their citizens, there's built-in pressure for accountability. No taxation without representation isn't just a revolutionary slogan. It's a fundamental principle of sustainable governance. But in a petrostate, the government represents the oil wells, not the citizens. As long as petroleum flows, the government can ignore popular demands for competence and honesty. Oil extraction, unlike farming or manufacturing, employs relatively few people. A modern oil field can produce billions of dollars in revenue with hundreds of workers, not millions. This concentrates wealth rather than distributing it. The money goes to whoever controls the wells, not to a broad base of productive citizens. Venezuela fell into every trap of the resource curse. Agriculture and manufacturing declined because they couldn't compete with imported goods purchased with strong petrodollars. Corruption flourished because there was so much money to steal and so little accountability. Education and training focused on petroleum engineering rather than diversified skills. The entire economy became oriented around extracting, refining, and exporting one commodity. When that commodity's price is high, everything seems fine. The government spends lavishly, subsidies flow, imports are cheap, and critics can be dismissed as pessimists who don't understand Venezuela's unique advantages. But when prices fall, the entire structure collapses because there's no diverse economic base to fall back on. Those who remember the decline of one-industry towns, coal mining communities, steel towns, textile mill cities, will recognize the pattern. When that single industry fails, everything fails. The difference is that Venezuela wasn't a town. It was an entire nation of 30 million people gambling its future on the sustained high price of a single commodity. Economists and development experts warned about this for decades. The prescription was clear: diversify the economy, invest oil revenues in education and infrastructure that would support non-petroleum industries, build institutions that could govern effectively regardless of oil prices, resist the temptation to spend every dollar of boom time revenues. Venezuela did none of these things. Neither the old political establishment nor Chávez's revolutionary government seriously addressed the fundamental dependency. Why? Because diversification is hard and politically unrewarding. It requires investing in long-term capacity building while enduring short-term austerity. It means saying no to subsidies and spending programs that voters love. It means accepting lower living standards today to build a sustainable economy for tomorrow. No politician who told Venezuelans they needed to tighten their belts while sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, would last long in office. So nobody did. The easy money kept flowing, and everyone pretended it would last forever. Between 2000 and 2008, oil prices climbed from around $25 per barrel to nearly $150. For Venezuela, this was a deluge of money beyond anything even the boom years of the 70s had produced. Billions upon billions of dollars flowing into government coffers year after year. If any period offered the chance to fix fundamental problems and diversify the economy, this was it. Chavez chose instead to accelerate his revolutionary program. He nationalized foreign oil companies' operations, taking control of fields that had been developed under profit-sharing agreements. He nationalized electricity companies, telecommunications firms, and major industries. He confiscated agricultural land for redistribution. He imposed price controls on food and consumer goods to combat inflation. Each measure was popular with his base and made a certain political sense. Why should foreign companies profit from Venezuelan oil? Why should necessities be expensive when the government could simply decree lower prices? To supporters, these were obvious justice. To economists, they were disasters waiting to happen. Nationalizing industries transfers ownership to the state, but it doesn't automatically create competence or efficiency. PDVSA, once among the world's most professional oil companies, saw thousands of experienced engineers and managers fired or driven out for political reasons. They were replaced with loyalists whose primary qualification was support for the revolution, not understanding of petroleum engineering. Oil production began declining. Fields weren't properly maintained. Investment in new capacity lagged. Technical expertise evaporated. The competent professionals who'd been purged found work with other oil companies internationally. Venezuela was left with deteriorating infrastructure and diminishing institutional knowledge. The same pattern repeated across nationalized industries. Take over a profitable cement plant. Appoint political commissars to run it. Watch productivity collapse. Nationalize farms. Redistribute land to workers with no training or equipment. Watch agricultural production fall further. Impose price controls on food. Watch domestic production become unprofitable and imports surge. Price controls deserve special attention because they're a case study in how good intentions create perverse outcomes. If milk costs 10 bolivars to produce, but the government mandates it must sell for 7 bolivars, what happens? Dairy farmers lose money on every liter sold. Some go bankrupt. Others slaughter their herds and convert to other activities. Still others start selling on the black market at real prices. legal domestic production collapses. The government then imports milk with oil revenues to fill the gap, distributing it through state-controlled stores. This creates dependency on imports, opportunities for corruption, who controls import licenses, and artificial demand because products are priced below cost. Shortages become inevitable. These weren't theoretical problems. By 2007, shortages of basic goods were appearing. Milk, meat, toilet paper, cooking oil. Products that had been abundant became sporadic. Lines formed outside supermarkets. The government blamed hoarding and sabotage by counter-revolutionary elements. The real problem was that they'd made production unprofitable while encouraging consumption through below-cost pricing. Chávez's response to shortages was to double down on control, create more state-controlled distribution networks, impose stricter price regulations, threaten producers with nationalization if they didn't comply, blame foreign conspiracies and domestic oligarchs. Everything except acknowledge that the policies themselves were failing. The fundamental economic madness was this: Venezuela was consuming more than it produced in almost every sector except oil, financing the gap with petroleum revenues, and simultaneously allowing its oil industry to deteriorate through politicization and underinvestment. It was like a family living beyond its means on credit cards, while also failing to show up for work at the high-paying job that made the whole arrangement possible. High oil prices masked these problems. When crude sold for $100 per barrel, even a declining industry with increasing inefficiency could still generate enormous revenues. The government kept spending, kept redistributing, kept expanding programs and subsidies. Poverty continued falling. Chávez's popularity remained strong, and critics could be dismissed as prophets of doom proven wrong by continued prosperity. But the prosperity was a mirage, sustained only by historically high and unsustainable oil prices. The economy wasn't growing in any sustainable way. It was consuming its seed corn while calling it a harvest. Hugo Chávez died of cancer in March 2013. He was 58 years old. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, lacked Chávez's charisma and popular touch, but inherited the same system and the same assumptions. For about 18 months, inertia kept things moving. Then the bill came due. In mid-2014, global oil prices began falling. By early 2016, crude that had sold for over $100 per barrel was trading below $30. For Venezuela, this wasn't a recession. It was an apocalypse. The government's entire fiscal structure assumed oil would stay expensive. Spending commitments, subsidies, social programs, government payrolls, debt service. All of it was budgeted based on revenues that suddenly evaporated. It was like a household budgeting for a six-figure income, discovering that their salary had been cut to minimum wage. But all their mortgage payments, car loans, and credit card bills stayed the same. Maduro's government, lacking Chávez's political capital and facing an economy now in freefall, made the worst possible choice. They started printing money. When tax revenues collapse and oil sales crash, a government has few options. They can cut spending drastically, raise taxes, borrow money, or print currency. Cutting spending meant ending programs millions depended on. Raising taxes in a contracting economy was political suicide. International lenders were increasingly unwilling to extend credit to a government so obviously mismanaging its economy. That left printing money. The Central Bank of Venezuela began creating bolivars with abandon. Need to pay government employees? Print money. Inflation, already a problem, began accelerating. 10% annually became 20%. 20 became 50. 50 became 100. By 2016, inflation was running at several 100% annually. By 2017, it crossed into four-digit territory. By 2018, Venezuela had achieved something remarkable and terrible: hyperinflation on a scale not seen since Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. Think about what hyperinflation means in practical terms. You wake up, and a cup of coffee costs 100 bolivars. By afternoon, it costs 120. By next week, it costs 300. Prices aren't rising annually or monthly or even daily. They're rising hourly. Any money you hold loses value by the minute. Your savings evaporate. That retirement fund you built over decades? Worthless. The cash you keep for emergencies? It won't buy a loaf of bread. Your monthly salary, if you're lucky enough to have formal employment, is paid at the beginning of the month, but loses most of its value before month's end. Workers rush to spend paychecks immediately, buying anything that will hold value better than currency. The currency itself became an absurdist joke. Venezuela had to keep printing larger and larger denominations. 1,000 bolivar notes became 10,000, then 100,000, then 1 million. Eventually, the government gave up and created the Bolivar Soberano, the sovereign bolivar, knocking 5 zeros off the currency. A 100,000 bolivar note became worth 1 Bolivar Soberano. It didn't help. Inflation just continued in the new currency. Shortages went from occasional to universal. Supermarkets had empty shelves more often than stocked ones. Basic medicines disappeared. Toilet paper became a luxury. people began losing weight, not from dieting, from hunger. Childhood malnutrition rates spiked. Diseases that had been controlled for decades, like diphtheria and measles, returned because vaccines were unavailable. Those who remember genuine hardship, Depression-era scarcity, wartime rationing, post-war shortages, will recognize what this meant. Except Venezuela's crisis was entirely self-inflicted, happening in the 21st century to a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. It wasn't war or natural disaster or external attack. It was policy failure on a scale almost too comprehensive to believe. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. No antibiotics, no painkillers, no surgical equipment. Doctors performed operations without anesthesia. Patients brought their own sutures, if they could find them. Infant mortality, which had been declining for decades, reversed course. People died from treatable conditions because there were no medical supplies to treat them. The electrical grid, neglected for years, began failing. Blackouts became routine. Not rolling brownouts, complete failures lasting hours or days. In Caracas, a modern city that had once prided itself on reliable infrastructure, residents learned to live without assuming they'd have electricity. Refrigerators became useless. Air conditioning was a memory. Elevators in high-rise apartments trapped people or simply stopped working. Crime exploded. When the economy collapses and police aren't paid enough to survive, when basic goods are scarce and legal methods don't provide for families, criminality becomes almost rational. Caracas became one of the world's most dangerous cities. Kidnapping became routine. Armed robbery was epidemic. People avoided going out after dark. Those who could afford it hired private security or lived in gated compounds. The government's response to crisis was denial, repression, and scapegoating. They blamed American sanctions, which did exist but weren't imposed until after the economy had already collapsed. They blamed international conspiracies, opposition sabotage, speculators, hoarders, anyone except their own policies. They arrested opposition leaders. They shut down critical media. They manipulated elections. Democratic institutions that had survived decades eroded within years. When a nation collapses economically, people leave. What happened in Venezuela between 2015 and 2025 was a mass exodus on a scale the Western Hemisphere hadn't seen in peacetime memory. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, fled the country. These weren't just the wealthy or the politically connected. Everyone who could afford bus fare and had somewhere to go was leaving. Doctors, engineers, teachers, The professional class Venezuela had spent decades building with oil revenues, departed for Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, the United States, Spain. They left behind everything they couldn't carry because staying meant watching their children go hungry. The economic impact of this emigration was devastating. Venezuela lost its most productive, educated citizens, the people who could have helped rebuild. Brain drain doesn't begin to describe it. This was a hemorrhaging of human capital. Universities emptied out. Hospitals that were already struggling lost doctors and nurses. Schools lost teachers. Businesses lost managers and skilled workers. Those who remain remember when Venezuela was prosperous, when families weren't scattered across continents, when the future held promise rather than dread. Some stayed because they were too old or too poor to leave. Others stayed from stubbornness or duty, determined to endure or to fight for change. Many stayed because they simply had nowhere else to go. The receiving countries struggled to absorb this flood of refugees. Colombia alone received over 2 million Venezuelan migrants. Peru, Ecuador, Chile, countries that had their own economic challenges, suddenly hosted hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking work, shelter, anything better than what they'd left behind. International agencies called it a humanitarian crisis. That's accurate, but somehow inadequate to capture what it meant. Families split apart, perhaps permanently. Children growing up in exile. Elderly parents left behind. Careers ended, savings lost, lives disrupted in ways that might never be repaired. And all of it avoidable. That's the cruelest part. This wasn't natural disaster or foreign invasion. This was self-destruction. Let's step back and examine how an economy actually collapses, because what happened in Venezuela followed a predictable pattern that economists have documented in other contexts. Understanding the mechanism helps explain how something that seemed impossible became inevitable. Step 1. Develop complete dependency on a single commodity. Venezuela's economy generated 96% of export revenue from oil by 2014. Agriculture, manufacturing, services, everything else was vestigial, withered from decades of neglect and inability to compete with cheap imports purchased with strong oil revenues. Step 2. Allow institutions to deteriorate through politicization and corruption. When expertise is purged in favor of loyalty, when technical competence matters less than political reliability, institutions lose the capacity to function. PDVSA couldn't maintain production because it had lost its engineers. The central bank couldn't manage monetary policy because it had become a political tool. The court system couldn't enforce contracts because judges owed their positions to political patrons. Step 3. Create fiscal commitments based on unsustainably high commodity prices. Venezuela's government spending in 2012 assumed oil would stay above $100 per barrel indefinitely. Salaries, subsidies, social programs, debt payments, all budgeted as if the boom would never end. When prices crashed, there was no flexibility, no reserve, no alternative revenue source. Step 4. Respond to crisis with money creation rather than structural reform. This is where many economies face a choice. The hard path is austerity, reform, and restructuring. The easy path is printing money to maintain spending. Venezuela chose easy, and the result was hyperinflation that destroyed whatever value the bolivar still held. Step 5. Watch price controls and currency manipulation create artificial scarcity. When you mandate that goods must sell below production cost, production stops. When you manipulate exchange rates to make imports artificially cheap, you destroy domestic industry. Step 6. Allow infrastructure to fail from underinvestment and mismanagement. Electrical grids, water systems, roads, ports, all require constant maintenance and periodic upgrades. When resources are diverted to political programs and corruption, infrastructure deteriorates. Eventually, it fails completely, and modern economic activity becomes impossible. The vicious cycle feeds on itself. Shortages drive hoarding. Hoarding creates worse shortages. Inflation makes planning impossible. Lack of planning reduces production. Reduced production means less to tax. Less tax revenue means more money printing. More money printing accelerates inflation. Each problem creates the next, and the system spirals into collapse. Those with military experience or who worked in complex systems will recognize this pattern. It's mission failure through compounding errors. Each mistake is survivable in isolation, but combined, they create cascading failure. The organization, or in this case, the economy, lacks the resilience to absorb shocks because all the redundancies have been stripped away. The tragedy is that each step seemed rational to the people making decisions. Nationalize oil to reclaim sovereignty. Sounds good. Hire loyal supporters to run state enterprises. You need people you trust. Maintain spending during crisis to protect the poor. Compassionate. Print money when you can't raise revenue. No alternative. None of these decisions, viewed in isolation by actors with limited information and political pressures, appears catastrophically wrong. But collectively, they destroyed an economy. Historians still debate whether this was inevitable, given Venezuela's oil dependency, or whether better leadership could have navigated the 2014 price crash without catastrophic collapse. If you've lived through economic crises, recessions, inflation, industrial collapse, I'm curious what you think. Could competent management have prevented the worst? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Numbers tell part of the story. GDP contracted by more than 60% between 2013 and 2020. Inflation exceeded 1 million% at its peak. 7 million people fled. But statistics can't capture what collapse actually means in daily life for those who endure it. Imagine raising children in these conditions. You wake before dawn to stand in line at a supermarket, hoping they'll have food, and that you can afford it with money that loses value hourly. You skip meals so your children can eat. You watch them lose weight despite your sacrifices. You can't afford medicine when they're sick. You can't find medicine even if you could afford it. You teach them to ignore hunger, to accept that dinner might be rice and nothing else, that breakfast might not happen. You're educated, perhaps a teacher or engineer. Your skills are worthless in an economy where jobs barely exist, and the ones that do pay salaries that can't buy a week's groceries. You consider leaving, but you're responsible for elderly parents who can't survive the journey. You're trapped between impossible choices. Healthcare workers faced impossible situations. Doctors performed surgeries with whatever they could improvise. Nurses reused disposable supplies because there were no new ones. Patients died from infections that antibiotics would have cured, from complications that proper equipment would have prevented, from diseases that vaccines would have stopped. Medical professionals who'd spent years training to save lives instead watched people die from want of basic supplies. Teachers taught in schools without books, without supplies, without reliable electricity. Their salaries wouldn't buy a week's food. Many held second and third jobs just to survive. Some gave up and left the profession, left the country. Those who stayed did so from dedication that bordered on martyrdom, teaching children whose parents couldn't afford to feed them properly, in buildings that were falling apart, for pay that was essentially worthless. The elderly suffered particularly. Those who'd worked their whole lives and saved for retirement watched their savings evaporate. Pensions became worthless. Medications for chronic conditions disappeared. Many were abandoned by children who fled the country, left to survive on their own in conditions that challenged healthy young adults. And yet, people adapted because humans are remarkably resilient. Communities organized to share resources. Extended families pooled what little they had. Neighbors helped neighbors. Venezuela gardens sprouted in urban areas, people growing food wherever they could find soil. Informal markets emerged where goods could be traded or bought at real prices rather than the fiction of official rates. Venezuelans abroad sent money home, remittances that became crucial income for families who remained. $100 from a relative in Colombia or the United States could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The diaspora maintained connections, sending not just money, but medicines, supplies, hope. This isn't ancient history. This happened in the 21st century, in a country that a generation earlier had been prosperous and stable. People your age remember when Venezuela was wealthy. They lived the boom years. They can tell you what was lost because they experienced it directly. The international community watched Venezuela's collapse with a mixture of concern and calculation. By 2017, the United States and European nations began imposing economic sanctions targeting Venezuelan government officials and later the oil industry itself. The stated goal was to pressure the Maduro government into democratic reforms and humanitarian improvements. Sanctions are a blunt instrument, and their effectiveness in Venezuela remains hotly debated. The Maduro government blamed sanctions for the economic collapse, which is convenient propaganda, but historically inaccurate. The economy had already contracted dramatically before significant sanctions were imposed. The oil price crash and policy failures had done most of the damage before external pressure arrived. That said, sanctions did hurt. Restrictions on oil sales and financial transactions made it harder for Venezuela to market crude and access international banking. They complicated efforts to maintain what was left of the oil industry. They probably accelerated economic decline that was already well underway, though by how much is difficult to determine precisely. The humanitarian impact of sanctions is where things get morally complex. Restricting oil revenue theoretically pressures the government, but in practice, governments rarely suffer. They maintain access to resources even when populations starve. Sanctions may have worsened shortages of medicine and food, though disentangling their effect from the disaster already in progress is nearly impossible. Regional countries, particularly Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, bore the burden of the refugee crisis without significant international support. They took in millions of displaced Venezuelans, provided services, dealt with social tensions, all while managing their own economic challenges. Their response was remarkably humanitarian, considering the scale and the lack of resources. Political efforts to resolve the crisis went nowhere. The opposition, fractured and disorganized, couldn't mount effective resistance. International recognition of opposition, leader Juan Guaidó as interim president in 2019, was bold symbolism, but changed nothing on the ground. Maduro maintained control of the military, the courts, the electoral machinery. Actual power, in other words, while Guaidó had international recognition and little else. Negotiations mediated by third parties produced agreements that went unimplemented. The government made promises it didn't keep. The opposition demanded conditions that weren't met. Meanwhile, ordinary Venezuelans continued suffering while politicians and diplomats talked. Today, in 2025, Venezuela exists in a strange state of stabilized catastrophe. The economy has stopped contracting, but isn't growing. Hyperinflation has been controlled through dollarization. Venezuelans now transact primarily in US dollars rather than bolivars, essentially admitting that their own currency is worthless. This has stabilized prices, but at the cost of monetary sovereignty and any pretense that the bolivar functions as actual money. Oil production has stabilized at around 700,000 barrels per day, down from over 3 million at peak. That's enough to generate some revenue, but nowhere near enough to fund a recovery or restore the social programs that once made Venezuela seem like a model. The industry needs massive investment to recover. Investment that isn't forthcoming because the political and economic risks remain too high for most potential investors. Some Venezuelans are returning, not millions, but enough to be notable. They come back because exile is hard, because they miss home, because they've concluded that Venezuela, at its worst, is still better than struggling as refugees elsewhere. They find a country that's profoundly changed. The prosperity they remember is gone. The sense of possibility has been replaced by resignation. A parallel economy has emerged. Those with access to dollars, from remittances, online work, or informal business, can live reasonably. Not comfortably by previous Venezuelan standards, but adequately. They shop in stores that stock imported goods priced in dollars. They pay for private health care since the public system barely functions. They've created a bubble of semi-normal life within a failed state. Those without dollars, probably the majority, struggle on. They work multiple jobs for wages that barely sustain life. They depend on remittances from relatives abroad. They emigrate if they can. They endure if they can't. The Maduro government maintains power through a combination of military support, Russian and Chinese assistance, and the opposition's continued weakness. Democratic institutions are thoroughly hollowed out. Elections are manipulated. Dissent is suppressed. The government functions less as a democracy and more as an authoritarian regime with democratic window dressing. Corruption has, if anything, gotten worse. With formal economic activity so limited, state-connected elites enriched themselves through control of what remains: import licenses, currency exchange access, oil revenue allocation. Those close to power live very differently from ordinary Venezuelans, which breeds resentment, but also resignation. Venezuela's story isn't just about one country's misfortune. It's a case study in how nations destroy themselves through policy choices that seem defensible individually, but are catastrophic collectively. Other countries can learn from these mistakes if they're willing to look honestly at what happened and why. Lesson 1. Diversification isn't optional for resource-dependent economies. Norway and Venezuela both have substantial oil wealth. Norway built a massive sovereign wealth fund, invested in education and infrastructure, and maintained diverse economic sectors. Venezuela consumed its oil wealth in real time, building dependency rather than resilience. The difference in outcomes is stark. Lesson 2. Institutions matter more than ideology. Venezuela's collapse accelerated under Chávez's socialism, but the seeds were planted during decades of ostensibly capitalist governance. The common factor was weak institutions corrupted by oil money and political patronage. Strong, independent courts, professional bureaucracies, and competent regulatory agencies aren't luxuries. They're essential for sustained prosperity. Lesson 3. Populist economics, price controls, heavy subsidies, money printing to fund spending can feel good in the short term, but create disasters in the medium term. Every serious economist warned Venezuela about these policies. They were ignored because political calculus favored immediate gratification over sustainable development. Lesson 4. When an economy starts failing, political leaders face enormous pressure to choose short-term solutions that make things worse. Cutting spending is politically unpopular. Raising taxes in a recession hurts. Telling people the truth about how bad things are costs votes. So, leaders print money, impose price controls, nationalize industries, blame outsiders, anything except make the hard choices that might actually fix problems. Lesson 5. Emigration is both a relief valve and a catastrophic loss for failing states. Those who leave suffer displacement, but often rebuild lives successfully elsewhere. Those who remain lose the engineers, doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs who might have helped reconstruction. The brain drain becomes self-reinforcing. The more talented people leave, the harder it becomes for those who remain to rebuild, which drives more talented people to leave. For those who remember the Cold War, Venezuela's trajectory might seem like vindication of capitalism over socialism. That's too simple. Venezuela's model was hardly pure socialism, and its problems began long before Chavez. The real lesson is about institutional quality, economic diversification, and the dangers of resource dependency. Lessons that apply regardless of whether a country labels itself capitalist or socialist. Those who lived through the oil shocks of the 70s, the inflation of the 80s, the various financial crises since, you understand that economic stability isn't natural or automatic. It requires sound policies, strong institutions, and sometimes painful choices. Venezuela shows what happens when a nation consistently avoids those choices and assumes prosperity is permanent. Can Venezuela recover? The honest answer is eventually, probably, but not quickly and not easily. The country still has enormous oil reserves. It still has millions of educated, hard-working people, both domestically and in diaspora. It has infrastructure that, while damaged, could be repaired. The fundamentals for recovery exist. What's missing is governance. As long as the current system persists, authoritarian control, endemic corruption, institutional weakness, policy incompetence, significant recovery is impossible. You can't rebuild an economy without rule of law, without competent management, without policies that encourage rather than punish productive activity. Political change would help, but isn't sufficient by itself. Even with better leadership, Venezuela faces massive challenges. The oil industry needs billions in investment to restore production capacity. Infrastructure needs rebuilding. Institutions need reconstruction. The diaspora needs convincing that it's worth returning. International creditors need reassurance that they'll be repaid. None of this happens quickly. History offers both hope and caution. Germany recovered from post-war devastation. Japan rebuilt from atomic bombing. South Korea transformed from impoverished to wealthy. But these recoveries required not just good policies, but often external assistance, favorable circumstances, and decades of sustained effort. Venezuela has fewer advantages than these examples had. The diaspora could be crucial to recovery if they return. 7 million Venezuelans living abroad have gained education, skills, and experience in functioning economies. They've seen what works elsewhere. They could bring back not just expertise, but also capital, connections, and knowledge. But why would they return to a country that drove them away unless conditions fundamentally change? Regional countries have a stake in Venezuela's recovery, if only to stem the refugee flow and restore some stability to a neighbor. But they have limited capacity to force change and their own problems to manage. International organizations might help, but their assistance typically requires reforms that the current Venezuelan government shows no interest in implementing. If you've watched nations recover from disasters, whether post-war reconstruction, economic collapse, or other catastrophes, what do you think makes recovery possible? Is it leadership, institutions, external help, or something else? Share your thoughts below. Your generation witnessed remarkable recoveries, but also failures. What patterns did you see? We return to where we began, silent streets in a nation that should be wealthy. Those streets aren't entirely silent. People still live there, work there, endure there, but they're quieter than they should be. The vibrancy of prosperity is gone. The streets remember better days. Venezuela's story resonates because it's a warning written in crude oil and human suffering. It shows how quickly prosperity can vanish when policy choices accumulate. It demonstrates that resource wealth is a curse if not managed wisely. It proves that institutions matter more than ideology, that competence matters more than good intentions, that sustainable development requires discipline and patience. For Venezuelans who lived through the transformation, from boom to bust, from hope to desperation, from prosperity to survival, the psychological impact may be the deepest wound. To have experienced genuine prosperity and then watch it destroyed must be profoundly disorienting. To have believed in a better future and seen those dreams shattered must create scars that don't easily heal. The elderly who remember Venezuela's golden age might find the current reality hardest to accept. They worked, saved, built lives based on reasonable expectations that the future would be at least as good as the present. They couldn't have predicted that policy failures would destroy what generations had built. They didn't deserve to see their life's work reduced to nothing by inflation, to watch their children flee, to end their days in poverty after decades of productive contribution. The young face different burdens. Many came of age during the collapse, knowing only crisis, never experiencing the prosperity their parents describe. They face choices their parents never imagined. Stay in a broken country with limited prospects, or emigrate to rebuild lives as outsiders elsewhere. There are no good options, only varying degrees of difficulty. And the departed, the 7 million who left, they carry Venezuela with them wherever they go. Their identity is shaped by a country that no longer exists in the form they remember. They're not quite refugees, not quite immigrants, something in between. Economic exiles from a nation that destroyed itself. Venezuela's economic roller coaster offers lessons that transcend one nation's tragedy. Resource curses are real. Institutions matter. short-term political expedience creates long-term catastrophes. Economic diversification isn't optional. Competence and honesty in governance aren't luxuries, but necessities. These aren't new insights. Development economists have understood them for decades. But Venezuela provides a recent, vivid demonstration of what happens when they're ignored. For other resource-rich nations, Venezuela's example should be sobering. Having oil or minerals or any concentrated natural wealth is both opportunity and danger. The opportunity is obvious: the chance to transform resource revenue into sustainable prosperity. The danger is that resource wealth makes bad governance sustainable longer than it otherwise would be, allowing problems to accumulate until they reach catastrophic proportions. Those who lived through Venezuela's boom years and remember the promise it held might feel a particular sadness about what was lost. This wasn't some impoverished backwater that failed to develop. This was a country that had achieved prosperity and then systematically destroyed it. The waste of potential is staggering. And yet, Venezuelans endure. They adapt, survive, find ways forward despite obstacles that would break many societies. There's courage in that persistence, a refusal to be entirely defeated by circumstances. The communities support each other. Families remain connected across continents. People maintain hope even when circumstances suggest hopelessness is more realistic. The streets are quieter than they should be. The nation is diminished from what it was and what it could have been. But Venezuela continues. Its story isn't over, though this chapter has been painful beyond measure. Oil still lies beneath its soil. People still live in its cities. Potential still exists, waiting for circumstances that might allow it to flourish. Whether those circumstances will arrive, and when, and under what conditions, these questions remain unanswered. For now, Venezuela exists in limbo, neither fully recovering nor entirely collapsing, suspended between a past it can't reclaim and a future it can't yet reach. Your generation holds memories and perspectives that younger people can't access. If tonight's exploration of Venezuela's economic transformation resonated with you, whether you remember the oil shocks, witnessed economic collapses elsewhere, or have your own stories about prosperity lost, I'd be honored if you shared your thoughts below. The lessons of Venezuela's story matter beyond one nation's borders. Your insights help all of us understand these patterns better. The quiet streets of Caracas and Maracaibo and Valencia aren't entirely silent. Life continues, stubborn and resilient. People wake each day and find ways forward. The oil that transformed Venezuela a century ago still flows, though more slowly now, into an uncertain future. And somewhere, perhaps, lessons are being learned that might spare another nation from following the same path from boom to bust, from promise to despair, from wealth to silent streets. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next one. Venezuela's story continues, as all stories do, written by those who endure and those who might yet return. The streets remember prosperity. Perhaps one day they'll know it again. Until then, they wait, patient and quiet, for whatever comes next.